November 19, 1942. The frozen steppe northwest of Stalingrad forces you to squint against the biting wind. It is just before dawn on the sector held by the Romanian Third Army, and the silence is deceptive. Suddenly, the horizon erupts in a blinding flash of violet and orange light that sears the retina. Seconds later, the earth beneath your boots shakes violently as thousands of Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers open fire simultaneously. The deafening roar drowns out the screams of men as bunkers collapse, signaling the beginning of the end for the German Sixth Army. As the smoke clears, a terrifying rumble rises from the snow-covered ravine. Out of the mist, the T-34 tanks appear like steel beasts, their wide tracks crushing the barbed wire with ease. The Romanian anti-tank guns, intended to protect the German flank, fire desperately, but their shells bounce harmlessly off the sloped Soviet armor. Panic begins to spread through the trenches as soldiers realize they have no effective weapons to stop this steel tide. Operation Uranus has begun, and the Soviet pincers are driving deep into the rear, threatening to encircle nearly 300,000 Axis troops trapped in the rubble of Stalingrad. Inside the city of Stalingrad, General Friedrich Paulus stares at his maps with growing dread. His Sixth Army has spent months grinding itself to dust in brutal house-to-house fighting, obsessively capturing 90% of the city on Hitler's orders. But this tactical obsession has left his flanks exposed, guarded only by ill-equipped Allied units. As reports of the Soviet breakthrough flood into his headquarters, Paulus realizes the hunters have become the prey. The strategic blindness of the German High Command has allowed the Red Army to amass a massive reserve force in secret, catching the Wehrmacht completely off guard. Far away in his East Prussian headquarters, Adolf Hitler refuses to accept the reality of the encirclement. He orders the Sixth Army to stand fast and declares Stalingrad to be a fortress that must be held at all costs. This designation of Festung Stalingrad is a death sentence for the men trapped within the Kessel, or cauldron. The Führer places his faith in the Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring, who pompously promises that his air force can supply the trapped army from the air. It is a boast made without calculating the logistical reality, dooming hundreds of thousands of men to starvation. The reality of the airlift becomes a nightmare immediately upon implementation. To keep the Sixth Army fighting, the Luftwaffe needs to deliver a minimum of 500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food every single day. But the Junkers Ju-52 transport planes are hindered by brutal winter storms, aggressive Soviet fighters, and icing conditions. On the best days, they manage barely a fraction of the necessary tonnage. Inside the pocket, the daily ration for a German soldier shrinks to a few ounces of bread and horsemeat, while the temperature plummets to 30 degrees below zero. While the tragedy unfolds on the Volga, another catastrophe strikes the German war machine thousands of miles away in the burning sands of North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, faces a revitalized British Eighth Army at El Alamein. For months, Rommel has been at the end of a tenuous supply line that stretches across the Mediterranean, where Royal Navy submarines and RAF bombers wreak havoc on Axis convoys. His tanks are running on fumes, and his men are exhausted from dysentery and the relentless desert heat, waiting for a blow they know they cannot parry. On the night of October 23, 1942, General Bernard Montgomery unleashes an artillery barrage of 1,000 guns that turns the desert night into day. The British have established total superiority in logistics and intelligence, knowing exactly where the German minefields are located. Unlike the fluid maneuver warfare, Rommel excels at this is a grinding battle of attrition. The British Sherman tanks, supplied in vast numbers by American industry, press forward relentlessly. Rommel requests permission to maneuver and retreat to save his army, but Hitler issues another fanatical order to stand and die where they are. The situation in the Mediterranean theatre worsens significantly on November 8 with the launch of Operation Torch. An immense Anglo-American armada appears off the coast of French North Africa, landing troops in Morocco and Algeria, the strategic nightmare of a two-front war, which Germany has always feared, is now a reality even within the African theatre. The Panzer Army Africa is now caught in a giant vice, with Montgomery pushing from the east and the fresh American forces advancing from the west. The Mediterranean, once a potential German lake, is rapidly becoming an Axis graveyard. Back on the Eastern Front, the situation for the trapped Sixth Army reaches a critical breaking point in December. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launches Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief effort to break through the Soviet ring and rescue Paulus. The 6th Panzer Division fights valiantly, pushing through blinding snowstorms to get within 30 miles of the pocket. The soldiers inside Stalingrad can hear the distant thunder of Manstein's guns. Sparking a flicker of hope, they watch the horizon, praying to see the grey shapes of German tanks. But the fuel tanks of the relief force run dry. Hitler refuses to allow Paulus to break out to meet the relief force, insisting that they can hold the city and be relieved simultaneously. This inflexibility seals the fate of the operation. The Soviets launch their own counteroffensive, threatening to encircle Manstein's forces as well, forcing him to retreat. The door to the cauldron slams shut forever. Inside Stalingrad, the discipline of the Wehrmacht begins to erode under the weight of typhus, frostbite, and despair. Men collapse in the snow, too weak to stand, and are buried where they fall by the drifting white powder. By January 1943, the German perimeter in Stalingrad has shrunk to a few ruined city blocks. The Soviet forces, sensing the kill, tighten the noose with relentless artillery barrages and infantry assaults. The German field hospitals are scenes of horror, overflowing with wounded men who have no medicine, bandages, or hope of evacuation. The last planes to leave the pit carry only specialized technicians and a few lucky wounded, while thousands of letters remain behind, undelivered testaments to a doomed army. The myth of the invincible German soldier is dying in the ruins of the city that bears Stalin's name. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promotes Paulus to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall. The promotion carries a grim implication. As no German field marshal has ever surrendered in history, the Führer expects Paulus to commit suicide rather than fall into Soviet hands. However, the next day, Soviet soldiers enter the basement of the Univermag department store, which serves as the German headquarters. Paulus, gaunt and unshaven, surrenders his pistol. The Battle of Stalingrad ends, resulting in the total destruction of the entire Sixth Army and its allied formations. The scale of the defeat is difficult for the German public to comprehend. Over 90,000 German soldiers march into Soviet captivity, a journey from which only 5,000 will ever return alive. The material losses are equally staggering. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft are destroyed or captured. More importantly, the aura of German military superiority has been shattered irrevocably. The initiative has passed to the Red Army, which now possesses the confidence and the numbers to push the Wehrmacht back all the way to Berlin. In the aftermath of these dual catastrophes in Stalingrad and North Africa, the Nazi regime is forced to confront the failure of its Blitzkrieg strategy. The quick victories of the early war years relied on speed and shock to overwhelm opponents before economic disparities could matter. Now, Germany is locked in a prolonged war of attrition against a coalition of global powers with vastly superior industrial capacity. The frantic attempt to mobilize the German economy begins, spearheaded by Joseph Goebbels in his famous Sportpalast speech, where he asks the hand-picked audience if they want total war. The defeat reveals the fundamental flaw in Hitler's strategic planning, the gross underestimation of his enemies. The Soviet Union was supposed to collapse like a rotten structure, yet it has produced new generals, new tactics, and the relentless T-34 tank. The United States was dismissed as a decadent, unmilitary nation, yet its troops are now pouring into the European theatre. As the spring of 1943 approaches, the German High Command looks at the maps with grim realization. The ground war has turned against them, but as they look up, they realize a new terror is gathering in the clouds, ready to bring the war home to the German cities. High above the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, the sky is no longer a sanctuary but a frozen battlefield. By the summer of 1943, the drone of engines becomes a permanent soundtrack to life in Germany, signaling the arrival of the United States 8th Air Force. Unlike their British counterparts who bomb under the cover of darkness, the Americans brazenly fly by day. Their B-17 flying fortresses glistening in the sun, they fly in tight combat box formations, a defensive strategy designed to overlap the fields of fire from their heavy machine guns, theoretically creating an impenetrable wall of lead against enemy fighters. The British Royal Air Force, led by Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, pursues a different and darker philosophy known as area bombing. Every night, streams of Lancaster and Halifax bombers cross the Channel to incinerate German cities, targeting the morale of the workforce as much as the factories themselves. The air raid sirens in the Ruhr Valley wail relentlessly, forcing exhausting civilians into damp cellars night after night. This round-the-clock bombardment, known as the Combined Bomber Offensive, is designed to give the German defences no rest, stretching the Luftwaffe and the civilian populace to the absolute breaking point. However, the Luftwaffe is far from defeated and remains a lethal adversary throughout 1943. Under the organization of General Josef Kammhuber, the Germans have constructed a sophisticated defense network called the Kammhuber Line, a seamless integration of Würzburg radar sets, searchlights, and night fighters creates a deadly gauntlet for Allied crews. On the ground, thousands of 88mm flak guns point skyward, filling the air with jagged shrapnel that tears through aluminum skin and flesh alike. For the Allied air crews, the statistical likelihood of surviving a 25-mission tour is terrifyingly low. The American doctrine relies heavily on the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer that promises pinpoint accuracy from 20,000 feet. But the reality of combat makes this precision a myth. Cloud cover, smoke from decoys, and the sheer terror of flying through a box of flak barrages force bombardiers to drop their payloads blindly or prematurely. The mighty industrial targets often escape with minor damage, while the surrounding residential areas are pulverized. The American commanders, General Ira Eaker and later Karl Spaatz, remain stubborn, insisting that daylight precision bombing is the only way to decapitate the Nazi war machine. The vulnerability of the unescorted daylight bomber is brutally exposed during the raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August and October of 1943. The targets are vital ball-bearing plants and aircraft factories, critical nodes in German production. As the B-17 seconds cross the German border, they move beyond the range of their fighter escorts, leaving them naked in the sky. Waiting for them are swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, flown by the Luftwaffe's Experten, veterans with hundreds of kills. The ensuing battle is a slaughter that shakes the U.S. Army Air Forces to its core. Inside the unpressurized fuselages of the B-17 seconds, the temperature drops to 60 degrees below zero, freezing sweat and blood instantly. Gunners slip on spent shell casings as they desperately track the German fighters slashing through their formations. The German pilots have developed new tactics, attacking head-on to target the cockpit or dropping air-to-air rockets to break up the formations. During the second Schweinfurt raid, 60 bombers are shot down, and hundreds of airmen are killed or captured. The losses are unsustainable, forcing the Americans to temporarily suspend deep penetration raids into Germany. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters for the Luftwaffe, warns Hitler that this victory is an illusion. While the Allies are losing planes, they are replacing them faster than Germany can produce new fighters. More critically, the Luftwaffe is bleeding its most precious resource-experienced pilots. A plane can be built in a week, but a pilot takes years to train. Yet, the Nazi leadership, obsessed with retaliation, demands that the Luftwaffe focus on bomber production to strike back at England, ignoring the urgent need for defensive fighters to protect the crumbling homeland. The turning point of the air war arrives in late 1943 with a single technological modification, the P-51 Mustang fitted with external drop tanks. For the first time, Allied fighters can escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang is a superior machine, faster and more agile than the aging German fighters. But its true value is its range. When the Luftwaffe fighters rise to attack the bomber streams, they are now bounced by swarms of Mustangs. The order changes from protecting the bombers to pursuit and destroy, effectively hunting the Luftwaffe to extinction over its own territory. In February 1944, The Allies launch Operation Argument, commonly known as Big Week. The objective is to bait the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition. Thousands of bombers target the German aircraft industry, not just to destroy the factories, but to force the German fighters into the air where they can be killed. The sky turns into a chaotic swirl of contrails and burning wreckage. By the end of the week, the Luftwaffe has lost huge numbers of planes and, more importantly, a generation of flight leaders. The back of the German fighter force is snapped, never to fully recover. With air superiority established, the Allies shift their sights to the single most critical vulnerability of the German economy: oil. General Spaatz prioritizes the destruction of synthetic oil plants and refineries, such as those at Leuna and Ploesti. The results are catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. Tanks sit abandoned on the Eastern Front for lack of diesel. The new jet fighters, the Me-262 seconds, are towed to runways by oxen because there is no fuel to taxi them. The shortage of aviation fuel also cripples the training program, forcing Germany to send teenagers into battle with only a few hours of flight time. Despite the relentless pounding, German Armaments Minister Albert Speer achieves a production miracle. By decentralizing industry and moving factories into underground tunnels and caves, like the Mittelwerk facility in the Harz Mountains, German aircraft production actually peaks in 1944. However, this statistic is meaningless. Thousands of fighter planes sit on railcars or hidden in forests, lacking the fuel to fly or the pilots to fly them. The transportation network, railways, bridges, and canals is systematically dismantled by Allied fighter bombers, severing the link between the factory and the front line. The terror of the air war reaches its grim crescendo in the firestorms of Hamburg and later Dresden. In Hamburg, a combination of explosive and incendiary bombs creates a vortex of superheated air that sucks the oxygen out of the city, creating temperatures high enough to melt asphalt. Tens of thousands of civilians perish in the inferno. These raids do not cause the German public to revolt against Hitler as the British hoped, but they create a profound sense of hopelessness. The home front, once promised safety by Goering, is now a landscape of rubble and ash. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe has effectively ceased to exist as a strategic threat. The Allied air forces roam the skies of Europe with total impunity, strafing everything that moves on the roads, from supply trucks to individual soldiers on bicycles. This total air supremacy is the absolute prerequisite for the upcoming invasion of France. The German army in the west is now blind and paralyzed, unable to move its panzer divisions in daylight without being spotted and destroyed. The roof has been blown off Fortress Europe, leaving it exposed to the coming storm. The destruction of the Luftwaffe also has profound psychological effects on the German soldier on the ground. In 1940, the Stuka dive bomber was the symbol of German terror. Now, the constant buzzing of Allied fighter bombers, nicknamed Jabos, is the source of daily anxiety. A common joke among the German infantry sums up the situation bitterly. If the plane is camouflaged, it's British. If it's silver, it's American. If it's not there, it's the Luftwaffe. The stage is set for the invasion, and the shield that once protected the Reich has been shattered into a million pieces. On the windy morning of July 10, 1943, the Mediterranean Sea churns violently, tossing the landing craft of the largest amphibious assault fleet in history toward the shores of Sicily. Operation Husky has begun, a massive undertaking designed to knock Italy out of the war and open the continent to Allied ground forces. British and American troops storm the beaches, fighting not only the Italian coastal defenders, but also the nauseating effects of seasickness caused by the gale force winds. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. 7th Army, is determined to prove American mettle after the humiliations of North Africa, initiating a fierce rivalry with his British counterpart, General Bernard Montgomery. The defense of the island falls to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a Luftwaffe officer turned army commander who proves to be a defensive genius, while the Italian units crumble, surrendering in droves or melting away into the countryside. The German divisions fight a tenacious rearguard action. Kesselring utilizes the rugged, volcanic terrain of Sicily to delay the Allied advance, turning every mountain road into a deadly ambush point. As Patton and Montgomery race toward the port of Messina in a contest of egos, Kesselring orchestrates a masterclass in evacuation. Under the noses of Allied air power, he successfully ferries tens of thousands of German soldiers and their heavy equipment across the narrow straits to the Italian mainland. The invasion of national soil sends a shockwave through the Italian political establishment, shattering the remaining facade of Benito Mussolini's power. On July 24, the Grand Council of Fascism meets in a tense, smoke-filled room in Rome to debate the future of the disastrous war. In a stunning betrayal, Mussolini's own lieutenants vote to remove him from power, ending 20 years of fascist dictatorship in a single night. The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, orders Mussolini's arrest, and the weary Italian public tears down the symbols of the regime, celebrating what they believe is the end of the conflict. However, the new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio plays a dangerous double game, publicly pledging loyalty to Germany while secretly negotiating an armistice with the Allies. Adolf Hitler, paranoid and anticipating this betrayal, has already prepared Operation Achse to secure the southern flank of his empire. As soon as the Italian surrender is announced in September, the Wehrmacht strikes with ruthless efficiency. German troops surround Italian barracks across the occupied zones, disarming their former allies at gunpoint. Those who resist are executed, while hundreds of thousands are shipped to internment camps in Germany as forced laborers. In one of the most daring special operations of the war, Hitler orders the rescue of his deposed friend, Mussolini, who is being held captive in a hotel high atop the Gran Sasso mountain range. On September 12, German paratroopers and SS commandos led by Otto Skorzeny crash-land gliders onto the jagged slopes in a brazen daylight raid. They overwhelm the stunned Italian guards without firing a shot and whisk the frail dictator away in a light aircraft. Mussolini is installed as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in the north, but he is now little more than a ghostly figurehead under total German control. Meanwhile, the Allies launch Operation Avalanche, the invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno, hoping to rush up the peninsula and capture Rome quickly. They are met with a ferocious counterattack by Kesselring's panzer divisions that nearly drives the landing force back into the sea. American General Mark Clark calls for urgent naval gunfire support, and battleships offshore fire massive shells directly into the German tank formations to stave off disaster. The illusion of a soft underbelly of Europe evaporates instantly. The Allies realize they are not marching into a liberated land, but slogging into a geographical nightmare suited perfectly for defense. The Italian peninsula is dominated by the Apennine Mountains, a rugged spine of peaks and ridges that runs down the center of the boot, flanked by rivers that flood in the autumn rains. Kesselring exploits this geography to construct a series of fortified defensive lines, the most formidable being the Gustav Line. Here, the German 10th Army digs in, blasting bunkers into solid rock and registering artillery on every approach. The Allied advance slows to a bloody crawl, measured in yards rather than miles, as the autumn mud swallows trucks and men alike. At the center of the Gustav Line stands the town of Cassino, overlooked by the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, a historic structure perched atop a 1,700-foot mountain. It dominates the Liri Valley, the only viable route to Rome, effectively blocking the Allied advance. Throughout the winter of 1943 and 1944, British, American, French, and Polish troops throw themselves against the German positions in a series of futile, meat-grinding assaults. The slopes are steep, bare of cover, and mined extensively, creating a killing zone that rivals the worst battlefields of the First World War. To break the deadlock, the Allies launch an amphibious landing at Anzio, behind the German lines. In January 1944, the landing achieves total surprise, and the road to Rome lies virtually open for a brief window of time. However, the American commander, General John Lucas, hesitates, choosing to dig in and consolidate his beachhead rather than thrusting inland. This caution proves fatal to the operation's momentum. Kesselring reacts with lightning speed, shifting divisions to seal off the beachhead. The Anzio pocket becomes a cramped, shell-pocked cage where Allied soldiers are under constant observation and artillery fire from the surrounding hills. Back at Cassino, the frustration of the Allied commanders leads to a controversial and tragic decision regarding the historic monastery. Believing the Germans are using the abbey as an observation post, they order its destruction by heavy bombers. On February 15, hundreds of B-17 seconds drop tons of high explosives, reducing the centuries-old cultural treasure to a smoking pile of rubble. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that the Germans had not been occupying the building. However, once it is destroyed, the elite German paratroopers move into the ruins, turning the debris into an impregnable fortress. The fighting for the ruins of Monte Cassino becomes a savage close-quarters brawl involving hand grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers. The German Green Devils, the elite Fallschirmjäger, hold out against overwhelming odds, earning the grudging respect of their enemies. It falls to the Polish II Corps, comprised of men exiled from their homeland by the Soviet invasion, to finally storm the heights in May 1944. Driven by a burning desire for vengeance, they capture the ruins at a horrific cost, their blood soaking the white poppies that grow on the slopes. With the Gustav Line finally broken during Operation Diadem, the German 10th Army begins a fighting retreat north. General Mark Clark, obsessed with the prestige of being the conqueror of Rome, disobeys orders to cut off the retreating German forces. Instead of trapping Kesselring's army, he turns his forces toward the Eternal City. On June 4, 1944, American jeeps enter Rome, and the population floods the streets to welcome the liberators with wine and flowers. It is a moment of triumph. But the strategic victory is incomplete. The German army escapes to fight another day on the Gothic line further north. The capture of Rome makes headlines around the world. But the glory is fleeting, lasting less than 48 hours. The eyes of the world immediately shift north to the beaches of Normandy, relegating Italy to a secondary theatre of war. The soldiers fighting in Italy begin to call themselves the D-Day Dodgers, a sardonic nickname acknowledging their forgotten status. They continue to fight a brutal, thankless war of attrition up the Italian boot, tying down over 20 German divisions that could have been used elsewhere, but never delivering the decisive knockout blow Churchill had promised. Behind the German lines, the war in Italy descends into a vicious civil conflict between fascist loyalists and communist partisans. The resistance movement grows in strength, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing German convoys in the mountains. The German response is draconian, guided by Kesselring's order to kill 10 Italians for every German soldier killed. Massacres like the one at the Ardeatine Caves in Rome leave a stain of atrocity on the campaign. The beautiful Italian countryside becomes a landscape of burned villages and hanging bodies, a testament to the total brutality of the occupation. As the Allies slog through the mud of Italy, the strategic focus of the Third Reich is forcibly torn away from the Mediterranean, while Kesselring has managed to conduct a brilliant defense, trading space for time. He cannot stop the inevitable compression of the German Empire. The loss of Italy deprives Germany of airfields and exposes the southern borders of Austria and the Balkans. But even as the Wehrmacht bleeds in the mountains of Italy, a far greater catastrophe is looming on the horizon in the east, where the greatest tank battle in history is about to decide the fate of the war. July 5, 1943. The sun rises over the endless steppes of the Kursk salient, revealing a landscape that is about to become the largest graveyard of armor in human history. The tall summer grass, usually swaying gently in the wind, now conceals nearly 2 million men and 6,000 tanks, coiled and waiting to strike. For months, the Eastern Front has been enveloped in an eerie, deceptive silence as both sides frantically build up their forces for the decisive showdown of the year. The German High Command has staked everything on Operation Citadel, a massive pincer movement designed to slice off the bulging Soviet front line, encircle 5 Soviet armies, and regain the strategic initiative lost at Stalingrad. Adolf Hitler has delayed the operation repeatedly, a fatal hesitation driven by his obsession with new technology. He refuses to unleash the attack until his new wonder weapons, the Panther and Tiger tanks, are delivered in sufficient numbers to the front lines. This delay proves to be a catastrophic strategic error, granting the Red Army precious months to prepare. While the Germans wait for their steel beasts to roll off the assembly lines, the Soviet High Command, alerted by British intelligence and the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, reads the German battle plans as if they were their own. They know exactly where, when, and how the blow will fall. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky have used this time to construct a defensive network of terrifying complexity. They have mobilized 300,000 civilians to dig thousands of miles of trenches and anti-tank ditches, transforming the Kursk salient into a fortress. The depth of the defense is staggering, stretching nearly 200 miles to the rear, consisting of 8 separate defensive belts. The fields are sown with over 400,000 mines, creating invisible death traps that density reaches 3,000 mines per mile in critical sectors. The Soviets do not intend to simply stop the Germans. They intend to bleed the Panzerwaffe white before launching their own counteroffensive. The battle begins not with a German Blitzkrieg, but with a preemptive Soviet artillery barrage that catches the assembling German troops in their staging areas. The element of surprise, crucial to the German doctrine of mobile warfare, is lost before the first engine is started. In the northern sector, General Walter Model's 9th Army attacks with brute force, sending heavy infantry and engineering units forward to clear paths through the minefields. But the density of the mines is far greater than anticipated. German pioneers are forced to crawl forward under withering machine gun fire, probing the earth with bayonets, while the tanks behind them sit idle, vulnerable to Soviet artillery observers. Model attempts to break the deadlock by deploying his heavy armor, including the monstrous Ferdinand tank destroyers. These 70-ton behemoths carry a powerful 88mm gun capable of destroying any Soviet tank from a mile away. However, they suffer from a critical design flaw. They lack a hull machine gun for close-in defense. As the Ferdinands rumble forward, Soviet infantrymen emerge from their camouflaged foxholes. Unafraid, they swarm the blind spots of the giants, disabling them with satchel charges and Molotov cocktails. The northern pincer bogs down after advancing only a few miles, turning into a grinding attrition battle around the railway station of Ponyry, which becomes known as Little Stalingrad. In the southern sector, the situation is different. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the most brilliant operational commander of the war, leads Army Group South with a powerful concentration of SS Panzer divisions. His forces, spearheaded by the elite Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, utilize the Panzerkeil or armored wedge formation. At the tip of the wedge are the heavy Tiger tanks, their thick frontal armor virtually impervious to standard Soviet anti-tank guns. Flanking them are the Panthers and modernized Panzer IVs, protecting the sides. This formation strikes the Soviet defenses with the force of a sledgehammer, smashing through the first defensive belt despite heavy losses. The debut of the Panzer V Panther, designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34, is marred by mechanical disaster. Rushed into combat without proper testing, the complex machines begin to break down before they even see the enemy. Fuel lines leak onto hot engines, causing tanks to spontaneously burst into flames. Transmissions shatter under the strain of the rough terrain. Of the 200 Panthers deployed on the first day, a staggering number are lost to mechanical failure rather than enemy fire. The crews fight desperately to keep their machines running, cursing the engineers back in Germany while Soviet shells hammer against their hulls. Overhead, the air war reaches a fever pitch as the Luftwaffe mounts its last great offensive in the east. Stuka dive bombers, now fitted with 37mm cannons under their wings, roam the battlefield hunting Soviet armor. The legendary ace Hans-Ulrich Rudel flies sortie after sortie, diving into the inferno of flak to plant shells into the thin engine decks of T-34 seconds. The sky is a chaotic swirl of dogfights, with thousands of aircraft grappling for air superiority. However, the Soviet Air Force, the VVS, is no longer the disorganized force of 1,941. They launch massive airstrikes against German airfields and supply lines, challenging the Luftwaffe for every cubic foot of airspace. Despite the fierce resistance, Manstein's forces in the south slowly grind their way forward, penetrating the second and third defensive lines. The fighting is savage and relentless, conducted amidst fields of tall sunflowers and wheat that catch fire, filling the air with thick, choking smoke. The crews inside the tanks bake in temperatures reaching over 100 degrees, their uniforms soaked in sweat and grease. They fight for days without sleep, fueled by Pervitin tablets and adrenaline. By July 11, the spearhead of the 4th Panzer Army breaches the last major defensive line and turns toward the small town of Prokhorovka. Sensing the critical danger in the south, the Soviet command releases its strategic reserve, the steppe front. General Pavel Rotmistrov leads the 5th Guards Tank Army to intercept the German advance. On July 12, the two massive armored forces collide on the fields outside Prokhorovka. The Germans, possessing superior long-range guns, prefer to engage from a distance. Knowing this, Rotmistrov orders his tank crews to close the gap at full speed. Steel to steel is the order. Hundreds of T-34 seconds charge across the open ground, ignoring the heavy losses inflicted by the German Tigers. Desperate to get within point-blank range, the resulting clash at Prokhorovka is a chaotic, swirling melee that defies tactical description. The dust kicked up by hundreds of tracks is so thick that the sun is obscured, creating a twilight gloom at midday. Tanks appear out of the fog like ghosts, firing at ranges of less than 50 yards. Turrets are blown off by the force of internal explosions. Burning crews bail out only to be cut down by machine gun fire. In some instances, out of ammunition, Soviet tanks ram the German Tigers, locking the two machines together in a death embrace of twisted metal. It is not a battle of maneuver, but a brutal slugging match of industrial annihilation. While the tactical result of Prokhorovka is debated, the Germans actually lose fewer tanks than the Soviets. The strategic implication is clear. The German breakthrough has been halted. Manstein believes he is on the verge of victory, arguing that he has depleted the Soviet reserves and needs only one final push to crack the line. He pleads with Hitler to allow the offensive to continue, convinced that the enemy is at the breaking point. But the timeline of the war has been altered by events thousands of miles away. The Allies have landed in Sicily, and the Italian front is collapsing. Hitler summons Manstein and Kluge to his headquarters on July 13 and delivers the fatal news. He needs to transfer elite divisions, specifically the SS Panzer Corps, to Italy to prevent the total loss of the southern flank. Operation Citadel is officially cancelled. Manstein is furious, believing he is being robbed of a victory. But the logic of the two-front war is inescapable. The withdrawal of the best German units from the Kursk salient signals the end of the offensive. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive has failed to achieve its objectives, stopped dead in its tracks. The cancellation of Citadel unleashes the stored kinetic energy of the Red Army. The Soviets immediately launch Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. The hunters become the hunted. The German armies, exhausted and depleted of their armored reserves, are hammered by fresh Soviet formations that seem to emerge endlessly from the east. The cities of Orel and Kharkov are liberated, and the Wehrmacht is forced into a long, desperate retreat towards the Dnieper River. The illusion that Germany can still win the war on the Eastern Front is shattered forever. The Battle of Kursk represents the death of the German Panzerwaffe as a strategic offensive weapon. The backbone of the experienced tank crews has been broken on the steppes. While German industry can produce more tanks, they cannot replace the veteran commanders and gunners who perished in the burning wheat fields. The initiative has passed irrevocably to the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the road leads only in one direction, west, towards the borders of the Reich. The German soldier, once the master of the battlefield, is now forced to look over his shoulder, knowing that the red tide can no longer be stopped. June 5, 1944. Outside the windows of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, the rain lashes against the glass, driven by a gale that whips the English Channel into a frenzy. The German meteorologists have predicted that this storm will last for days, making any Allied amphibious invasion impossible. Trusting this forecast, Rommel decides to leave the front to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany. Confident that the longest day is not yet at hand, it is a fatal miscalculation. Across the Channel, General Dwight D. Eisenhower listens to a different weather report, one promising a brief window of calm. Amidst a cloud of cigarette smoke, he utters the simple, momentous command, "Okay, let's go." In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, the sky over Normandy is filled with the roar of thousands of transport planes. American and British paratroopers drop behind enemy lines to secure causeways and bridges, their descent marked by chaos as pilots scatter them miles off target due to heavy flak. Lost in the hedgerows, men use cricket clickers to identify friend from foe in the dark. While the airborne operation is disorganized, it achieves a crucial unintended effect: confusion. The German commanders, receiving scattered reports of enemy troops everywhere, cannot determine the main point of attack. They hesitate to wake Hitler, and without his personal authorization, the vital panzer divisions remain locked in reserve, miles from the beaches. As the sun rises, the horizon fills with the largest armada ever assembled in the history of warfare. 7,000 ships carry over 150,000 men toward 5 code-named beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Omaha Beach, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions march directly into a slaughterhouse. The aerial and naval bombardment has missed the German bunkers, leaving the defenses intact. As the ramps of the Higgins boats drop, machine gun fire tears through the opening, cutting down rows of men instantly. The water turns red as soldiers drown under the weight of their equipment or are shredded by German artillery registered on the shingle. Despite the carnage at Omaha, the Allied foothold is secured through sheer grit and individual initiative. Brigadier General Norman Cotter walks calmly through the fire, rallying his shell-shocked men with the famous declaration that only 2 kinds of people are staying on the beach: the dead and those who are going to die. Small groups of rangers and engineers blow gaps in the wire, scaling the bluffs to silence the guns. By nightfall, the Atlantic Wall has been breached. The fortress Europe that Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years has been cracked open in a single day, and the endless stream of American supplies begins to pour onto the continent. However, the liberation of France does not follow immediately. The Allies soon find themselves bogged down in the bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy. These are not simple garden hedges, but ancient, thick tangles of roots and earth that act as natural fortifications, impervious to tank fire. The fighting devolves into a brutal, yard-by-yard struggle reminiscent of the trenches of World War I. German tanks, particularly the feared Tiger and Panther, lie in ambush, blasting Allied armor at point-blank range. It takes American ingenuity specifically, a sergeant welding steel prongs from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks to finally cut through the vegetation and restore mobility. While the Western Allies grind through the hedgerows, a catastrophe of infinitely greater magnitude strikes the German army on the Eastern Front. On June 22, the 3-year anniversary of the invasion of Russia, the Soviet Union launches Operation Bagration. The German High Command has been completely deceived by a masterclass in maskirovka, or military deception, convinced the Soviet attack will come in the south towards the oil fields. The Germans have stripped Army Group Center of its armor to reinforce the wrong sector. When the blow falls, it strikes the weakened center in Belorussia with the force of a tidal wave. The scale of Bagration dwarfs the fighting in Normandy. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks and massed artillery, smash into the German lines. The attack is coordinated with a massive partisan uprising behind German lines, which detonates thousands of charges on rail lines simultaneously, paralyzing the Wehrmacht's logistics. Army Group Center, the pride of the German army, simply disintegrates. Within weeks, 28 German divisions are encircled and annihilated. The front line is ripped open, creating a gap hundreds of miles wide through which Soviet tank armies pour, racing westward faster than the retreating German infantry can walk. The collapse in the east and the stalemate in the west drive a group of German officers to a desperate conclusion: Hitler must die to save Germany. On July 20, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg places a briefcase bomb under a heavy oak table in the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb explodes, shattering the room, but a table leg shields Hitler from the full blast. He survives with minor injuries, burnt trousers, and a shattered eardrum. The coup attempt in Berlin unravels quickly. The failure of the plot leads to a savage purge of the military leadership. Thousands are arrested, tortured, and executed, hung by piano wire. The Wehrmacht loses not only its best minds but also its cohesion, as political officers monitor every command for disloyalty. In late July, the Americans finally break out of the Normandy hedgerows with Operation Cobra. A massive carpet bombing campaign obliterates the German Panzer Division, opening a corridor for General George Patton's Third Army. Patton, a master of mobile warfare, races across France, bypassing strongpoints and wreaking havoc in the German rear. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army are threatened with encirclement near the town of Falaise. The resulting Falaise pocket becomes a corridor of death. Allied fighter bombers swarm over the trapped columns, destroying thousands of vehicles and horses. The stench of rotting corpses is so overpowering that pilots can smell it from their cockpits. On August 25, the impossible happens. Paris is liberated. The German commander of the city, General Dietrich von Toltitz, disobeys Hitler's order to burn the city to the ground and destroy its landmarks. As French armored columns and American infantry enter the city, the streets erupt in a delirious celebration of freedom. Women kiss the soldiers. Wine flows freely, and snipers are hunted down on the rooftops. For the Allies, it seems the war is all but won. The German army in the west is a broken rabble, retreating headlong toward the German border, abandoning their equipment by the roadside. However, the rapid advance creates a logistical nightmare for the Allies. The Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system of trucks, runs day and night to fuel the armies. But the supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. The advance stalls near the German border as tanks run dry. In a bid to end the war by Christmas, Field Marshal Montgomery proposes a daring, high-risk operation, Operation Market Garden. The plan is to drop 3 divisions of paratroopers to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, creating a carpet over which British armour can drive straight into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Market Garden, launched in September, is a bridge too far. The intelligence is faulty, missing the presence of 2 SS Panzer divisions, refitting in the area of Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne Division is dropped directly on top of these veteran units. Instead of a lightly defended rear area, they find themselves in a ferocious urban battle against heavy armour. The British paratroopers fight heroically at the Arnhem Bridge, holding out for days longer than planned with dwindling ammunition and no food. But the ground forces, delayed by a single narrow road and blown bridges, cannot reach them in time. The failure at Arnhem marks the end of the Allied sprint. The survivors of the British Airborne are evacuated across the Rhine under cover of darkness, leaving their wounded behind. The front line stabilizes as the autumn rains turn the ground to mud. The Germans, fighting now on the border of their own homeland, stiffen their resistance. The Volkssturm, a militia of old men and boys, is mobilized to dig anti-tank ditches. The optimism of the summer fades as the Allies realize the Nazi regime will not collapse. It will have to be beaten into submission, city by city. In the east, the Soviet steamroller finally pauses on the banks of the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw. The Polish Home Army, anticipating Soviet help, launches an uprising to liberate their capital from the Germans. But Stalin, with cynical brutality, orders his armies to halt. He allows the SS to crush the Polish resistance, destroying the non-communist leadership that might oppose his post-war plans. Warsaw is razed to the ground, block by block, while the Red Army watches from the other side of the river. It is a chilling preview of the Cold War to come. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich is compressed into a central fortress. The Allies are on the German border in the west. The Soviets are poised to strike into Prussia and Poland in the east. The strategic bombing campaign has reduced German cities to hollow shells. Yet, incredibly, Hitler plans one last gamble. He pulls his panzer divisions out of the line, refits them with the last reserves of fuel and ammunition, and looks at the map of the Ardennes forest. He believes that one great victory can split the Western Alliance and buy him the time he needs. The stage is set for the Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest is shrouded in a thick, freezing mist that clings to the pine trees like a shroud. This sector, known as the Ghost Front, is considered a quiet zone where exhausted American divisions come to rest and green units learn the ropes. In the foxholes of the 99th Infantry Division, soldiers stomp their feet to ward off the biting cold. Believing the war is practically over, they are completely unaware that just a few miles away, in the dense Eifel woods, the Third Reich has secretly amassed a force of over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks for one final, desperate gamble to alter the course of history. At 0530 hours, the pre-dawn silence is shattered by the thunder of 1,600 German artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously. The earth erupts along an 80-mile front, tossing trees and men into the air in a chaotic storm of splinters and steel. Before the American defenders can recover from the shock, the ghostly shapes of King Tiger and Panther tanks emerge from the fog, their engines roaring. Operation Wacht am Rhein has begun. Adolf Hitler's objective is ambitious to the point of delusion to split the British and American armies, seize the vital supply port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west so he can turn his full fury back to the east. The timing of the attack is predicated entirely on the weather. A heavy blanket of low-hanging clouds and fog grounds the overwhelming Allied air power, neutralizing the greatest advantage of the US and British forces. For the first time since the Normandy campaign, German panzer columns can move in daylight without being strafed by fighter bombers. General Sepp Dietrich leads the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, aiming for the Meuse River, while General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army strikes the center. The American lines, thin and overextended, buckle under the sheer weight of the assault, creating a massive bulge in the front line that gives the battle its name. Confusion and paranoia spread faster than the German tanks thanks to a secret operation codenamed Greif, led by the commando Otto Skorzeny. English-speaking German soldiers, dressed in captured American uniforms and driving captured jeeps, infiltrate behind Allied lines. They change road signs, cut telephone wires, and issue false orders. Rumors fly that they intend to assassinate General Eisenhower, forcing him to remain locked inside his headquarters in Versailles for days. Military police nervously grill their own officers on American pop culture trivia, like the winner of the World Series, or the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, arresting anyone who hesitates. The ruthlessness of the German offensive is laid bare near the village of Malmedy on December 17. Kampfgruppe Peiper, a spearhead unit of the 1st SS Panzer Division led by Joachim Peiper, captures a convoy of the US 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The American prisoners are herded into a field at the Bognes crossroads. Without warning, SS troopers open fire with machine guns and pistols. 84 American POWs are massacred in the snow. News of the atrocity spreads like wildfire through the American lines, stiffening the resolve of the GIs. The unwritten order goes out: there will be no more surrender. This is a fight to the death. Despite the initial shock, the strict German timetable begins to unravel at the critical road junction of St. Vith. Here, the scrap of the US 7th Armored Division, led by Brigadier General Bruce Clark, puts up a stubborn defense that defies logic. For days, they hold off vastly superior German forces, turning the town into a breakwater that splits the German advance. By the time St. Vith falls, the German schedule is hopelessly delayed. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes become clogged with traffic jams of tanks and supply trucks, burning precious fuel that the Germans simply do not have to spare. Attention soon shifts to the market town of Bastogne, a vital hub where 7 key roads converge. If the Germans cannot take Bastogne, their supply lines will be strangled. The US 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, is trucked in frantically to hold the town. They arrive without winter clothing, low on ammunition, and lacking medical supplies. By December 21, they are completely surrounded by German armor. Inside the perimeter, the paratroopers endure sub-zero temperatures in foxholes dug into the frozen ground. They scavenge food from abandoned cellars and count their remaining bullets, knowing no relief column is coming soon. On December 22, the German commander surrounding Bastogne sends 4 messengers under a white flag to the American headquarters. They present a typed note demanding the honorable surrender of the encircled town to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. The acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, reads the message and laughs, muttering, "Us surrender." Nuts. When pressed for a formal written response, he scribbles that single word, nuts. The confused German officers ask for an interpretation, to which the American colonel replies, "In plain English, it means go to hell." While the 101st holds on, a dramatic scene unfolds at the Allied command meeting in Verdun. General Eisenhower asks his commanders how long it will take to reorient their forces to strike the southern flank of the Bulge. Most generals estimate weeks. General George S. Patton, flamboyant and aggressive, shocks the room by declaring he can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals think he is boasting, but Patton has already ordered his staff to prepare the maneuver. In a feat of logistical brilliance, he rotates the entire Third Army 90 degrees and marches them north through the snow to relieve Bastogne. The turning point of the battle is decided not by tanks, but by the sky. For a week, Patton has ordered his chaplain to pray for good weather. On December 23, the prayers are answered. A high-pressure system moves in, clearing the mist and revealing a crisp blue sky. The Allied air forces unleash their pent-up fury. Thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons descend upon the exposed German columns. The roads of the Ardennes become corridors of death as the fighter bombers blast tanks, fuel trucks, and horse-drawn artillery wagons. The German advance, starved of fuel and pounded from the air, grinds to a halt. On December 26, the vanguard of Patton's 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, punches through the German encirclement at Bastogne. The first Sherman tank breaks the perimeter, linking up with the exhausted paratroopers. The siege is broken, effectively ending the German offensive threat. Hitler's gamble has failed. The panzers are now stranded without gasoline, their crews forced to abandon the mighty King Tigers and walk back towards Germany. The bulge in the line remains, but it is now a trap where American forces are slowly crushing the German divisions from both the north and the south. In a final act of desperation, the Luftwaffe launches Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, 1945. Almost 1,000 German fighters launch a low-level surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. While they manage to destroy hundreds of Allied planes on the ground, the cost is catastrophic. The Luftwaffe loses 300 pilots, including many of their remaining unit leaders and aces, to Allied anti-aircraft fire and, tragically, to their own flak batteries who were not informed of the secret operation. The German fighter force is effectively wiped out as a cohesive organization for the remainder of the war. By the end of January, the front line is restored to its original position. The Battle of the Bulge is the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army has ever fought, resulting in 80,000 American casualties. But for Germany, the result is fatal. They have suffered 100,000 casualties and lost virtually all their remaining aircraft and tanks. The reserves that were desperately needed to hold the Vistula River against the Soviets have been squandered in the snow of Belgium. The Wehrmacht is a hollow shell, and the Western Allies are now poised to breach the Siegfried Line and pour into the German heartland. The failure in the Ardennes breaks the morale of the German soldier. They have given everything their best equipment, their surprise attack, their last reserves, and they have been beaten. The retreat back into the Reich is a somber procession of broken men. The illusion of victory is gone. The only question remaining is how long the regime can drag out the inevitable. In the east, the Red Army has launched its Vistula-Oder offensive, rolling over the weakened German defences. The final act of the tragedy is about to begin, not on the borders, but in the burning ruins of the capital itself. April 16, 1945. The prelude to the apocalypse begins on the Silo Heights, the last natural defensive barrier before Berlin. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Marshal Georgy Zhukov unleashes a bombardment of such intensity that the shockwaves are felt 60 miles away in the German capital. As the artillery fire lifts, 140 searchlights snap on simultaneously, blinding the German defenders and casting long, terrified shadows against the smoke. The Soviet First Belarusian Front surges forward, a human and mechanical wave aimed squarely at the heart of the Third Reich. However, General Gotthard Heinrici, a master of defensive warfare, has withdrawn his troops from the front lines just before the barrage, leaving the Soviets to pulverize empty trenches. Despite Heinrici's tactical brilliance, the sheer mathematics of the assault makes the outcome inevitable. The Soviets outnumber the Germans 10-1 in manpower and 20-1 in tanks. For 3 days, the Wehrmacht fights with the desperation of men protecting their own families just miles to the rear. But by April 19, the Seelow Heights are overrun. The last organized defensive line protecting Berlin dissolves, and the T-34 seconds begin to race toward the suburbs. In the city, the air raid sirens wail for the last time, but they soon fall silent as the electricity grid fails. From now on, the only warning of approaching death is the whistle of incoming shells. Deep beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, in a damp concrete tomb known as the Führer Bunker, Adolf Hitler celebrates his 56th birthday on April 20. The mood is funereal rather than celebratory. The Nazi hierarchy gathers to pay their respects to a man who is a trembling shadow of his former self. Hitler, stooped and medicated, shuffles down the line of generals, shaking hands with a palsy-stricken grip. Above ground, the Soviet artillery begins to shell the city center for the first time, delivering a birthday salute of high explosives that crumble the facades of the government district. Most of the senior leadership, including Goering and Himmler, flee the city immediately after the ceremony, leaving the captain to go down with his sinking ship. The defense of the capital falls to a tragic, ragtag assortment of humanity. The elite divisions are gone, dead in the east or trapped in the west. In their place, the Nazi Party mobilizes the Volkssturm, a militia of old men and young boys. 12-year-old members of the Hitler Youth are handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and oversized helmets, then sent on bicycles to face the battle-hardened veterans of the Red Army. Fanatical SS squads roam the streets, not to fight the Soviets, but to hang any German soldier or civilian found shirking their duty. Bodies sway from lampposts with placards around their necks reading, "I was a coward," a grotesque display of a regime devouring its own children. On April 22, the reality of the situation finally pierces Hitler's delusional bubble. During the Daily Situation Conference, he demands to know the status of the counterattack by SS General Felix Steiner. A terrified General Hans Krebs is forced to whisper the truth: Steiner has no men, and the attack never happened. Hitler stares at the map in silence before exploding in a fit of uncontrollable rage. He screams that he has been betrayed by everyone, from the generals to the common soldier. Finally, slumped in his chair, he admits for the first time that the war is lost. He resolves to stay in Berlin and shoot himself rather than be captured. Above the bunker, the Battle of Berlin descends into a medieval savagery fought with modern weapons. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev race each other to the Reichstag, disregarding their own casualties in a contest for Stalin's favor. The fighting is house to house, room to room, and sewer to sewer. Soviet soldiers blast holes through the walls of apartment buildings to advance without exposing themselves to the streets. The U-Bahn tunnels become a hellish underworld where civilians shelter in the dark, only to be drowned when the SS blows the bulkheads under the Landwehr Canal to slow the Soviet advance. The Spree River runs red with blood as bridges are contested with bayonets and flamethrowers. On April 25, a moment of surreal hope and finality occurs 70 miles south of Berlin at the town of Torgau. Patrols from the US 69th Infantry Division meet soldiers from the Soviet 58th Guards Division on the wrecked bridge over the Elbe River. They embrace, share vodka and cigarettes, and pose for photographs. The meeting signifies that Germany has been cut in two. For the German leadership, this extinguishes the last desperate fantasy that the Americans might join them to fight the Bolsheviks. The Western Allies have halted their advance. Berlin is left entirely to the mercy of the Red Army. By April 28, the Soviet perimeter has shrunk to a few hundred yards around the Reich Chancellery. The Tiergarten, once the royal hunting ground and park, is a moonscape of cratered earth and splintered trees, used as an airstrip for the last desperate flights in and out. Inside the bunker, Hitler dictates his final political testament. a document filled with the same hateful rhetoric that started the war. Blaming the Jews for the destruction he brought upon the world, he marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, in a bizarre civil ceremony, while the shockwaves of exploding shells knock dust from the concrete ceiling. On the morning of April 30, with Soviet infantry less than 500 yards away, Hitler eats his final meal. He tests the cyanide capsules on his beloved German shepherd, Blondie, ensuring they work. In the afternoon, he and Eva Braun retreat to his private study. A single gunshot rings out. Outside the door, his aides wait a moment before entering. They find Hitler dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the temple and Eva dead from poison. In accordance with his strict orders, their bodies are wrapped in blankets, carried up the stairs to the garden of the Chancellery, doused in petrol, and set on fire. The man who set the world aflame burns in a shell crater, leaving behind nothing but ash. The nightmare in the bunker continues even after the dictator's death. Joseph Goebbels, the new chancellor, refuses to surrender. In a final act of fanatical devotion, his wife Magda systematically poisons their 6 children with cyanide while they sleep, refusing to let them grow up in a world without National Socialism. Afterward, Goebbels and his wife go up to the garden and commit suicide together. The spell breaks. The remaining generals and secretaries attempt a chaotic breakout through the subway tunnels, fleeing the approaching Russians like rats leaving a sinking ship. On May 2, General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense, orders the cessation of hostilities. He surrenders the city to General Zhukov. A strange silence falls over the ruins of Berlin, broken only by the crackle of fires and the sobbing of survivors. High atop the shattered dome of the Reichstag building, Soviet soldiers Yevgeny Kaldey raises the red banner of the Soviet Union. The image of the hammer and sickle flying over the ruined capital becomes the iconic symbol of the Third Reich's total defeat. The 1,000-year Reich has ended after 12 years of terror, leaving behind a continent of graves. In the north, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, named by Hitler as his successor as president, attempts to negotiate a partial surrender to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. The Allies reject this immediately. Meanwhile, Allied troops liberate the concentration camps Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The soldiers, battle-hardened veterans, vomit at the sight of the walking skeletons and the piles of unburied bodies. The full scale of the Holocaust is revealed to the world. General Eisenhower orders local German civilians to tour the camps and bury the dead, forcing them to confront the atrocities committed in their name. The end comes in a schoolhouse in Reims, France. On May 7, where General Alfred Jodl signs the unconditional surrender of all German forces. Stalin, however, insists on a ratification in Berlin, the lair of the fascist beast. On the night of May 8, in the mess hall of a German pioneer school in Karlshorst, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, bearing his marshal's baton, signs the final document under the stern gaze of Zhukov. Keitel looks at the French delegation present and mutters, "The French are here, too. That is all we needed." The guns finally fall silent across Europe at 11:01 p.m. The cost of the conflict is unfathomable. Over 60 million people are dead, the majority of them civilians. The great cities of Europe, Warsaw, Berlin, Stalingrad, Dresden, are piles of rubble. Germany ceases to exist as a sovereign state, divided into occupation zones that will soon harden into the Iron Curtain. The roads of Europe are clogged with millions of displaced persons, former slave laborers, and refugees trying to find homes that no longer exist. The war is over. But the suffering continues as winter approaches a continent on the brink of starvation. As the smoke clears over the ruins of Europe, a new world order emerges from the ashes. The United States and the Soviet Union stand as the two superpowers, their temporary alliance already fraying into mistrust. The era of European dominance is over. The atomic age is about to dawn. But for a brief moment in May 1945, there is only the overwhelming sense of relief. The most destructive conflict in human history has ended. The Nazi monster has been slain, its ideology buried in the bunker, proving that while evil can destroy, it cannot ultimately triumph.